join you today. Steve Sharkey is Vice President of Engineering and Technology Policy at T-Mobile, and today we're going to talk about 5G and 5G deployment. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Trey. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to INCOMPAS for having me here. Glad to be here.
Well, let's just hop right into it. You know, T-Mobile, after the merger with Sprint, is now the unquestioned leader, I think, in 5G deployment in the U.S., maybe the world. You've got a standalone 5G network, now covers more than 250 million people and 1.3 million square miles. What are you doing to sustain this lead and build on it?
Yeah, thanks, Trey. Yeah, I do think we're the global leader in deploying 5G, and like you said, we now have a standalone 5G network. We were the first to deploy standalone 5G, and that allowed us to not rely on our LTE as a kind of a base layer for that, and allowed us to extend our coverage, our 5G coverage, out to even more population, even into more rural areas. I mean, sustaining the lead, I think, is really, there's a couple of points there, right? I mean, it's not only the technology and fast rollout of 5G services that we're doing, but it's also how we approach our customers. We've taken over the number 2 spot for U.S. carrier, and that obviously comes as on the heels of our merger with Sprint, but it really shows the growth of the company over the years, right? And a philosophy of solving customer pain points, of approaching as a young carrier. So we led that effort with freeing customers from things that they didn't like being tied to a contract for a cell phone that tied to their service. We were able to separate that and just have a continual process of addressing pain points and treating customers that they want to. And then on top of that, though, we know we've always needed a strong network layer, and have worked hard. Our CTO Neville Ray is he's president of technology now, but has been just amazing at making sure that this network gets rolled out and strengthened over the years. And we are doing 5G differently than the other companies. We're doing it with a layer cake of spectrum, so that you've got a base layer in the 600 megahertz band that provides the coverage that you talked about, 1.3 million square miles, and covering pops. And then we're filling in with the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum that we acquired from Sprint to really boost the speeds and capacity of that network. And then, we've got millimeter wave to just have really strong speeds in those more densely populated areas where you need it.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Neville Ray, because he really has pushed the network forward, I think, and it's been instrumental to the build out that you've talked about and the performance that you're seeing. One of the things he said recently, that despite COVID, and all the constraints that go along with that, you're deploying sites at something like the rate of 700 per month, and he wants to accelerate that to 800 a month. How are you managing that pace? That's a lot of truck rolls. That's a lot of people. What goes into that?
Those are actually per week numbers, not per month. Week. Yeah, so we're doing about 100 cell sites a day that we're upgrading to 5G, and we'll look to increase that a little bit over that 100 per day. But it really is a testament to the engineering team, right? A lot of planning that goes into that, and preparation. We had a strong deployment of towers already that were going in and changing out that technology, and then you've got Sprint towers that we're changing out now, and either adding our 600 megahertz spectrum, changing out the 2.5 gigahertz technology on those towers. And it really is just a well-coordinated team that's been planning for this for a long time. And, you know, I think one of the strengths for T-Mobile is we've never waited, and we've been the fastest company to roll out spectrum. When we get spectrum, we don't wait. We roll it out. And it really comes, we don't wait until we have the spectrum to plan on what to do with it. There's a lot of planning that goes into that. And that goes for like the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. We were able to start turning that on 5G within, literally days of closing on the Sprint, closing the Sprint merger in Philadelphia. We began within days, and that's been, rapidly increasing pace.
So at the rate of 700 to 800 sites per week, it's an amazing pace. Could you talk a little bit about just, obviously there's a lot of logistical planning that goes in ahead of time, but what happens when, the technician or technicians roll up to a site sort of physically? What does it mean to upgrade to 5G or to integrate these networks and knit together the type of layer cake, low, mid, and high band spectrum that you talked about earlier?
Yeah, I think it depends site by site on exactly what's required. And I actually had a chance to go out and see one of the sites being done with Commissioner Carr. Came out to one of our sites, and where we were. So, in that case, you were pulling down old antennas for 700 megahertz, that just did 700 megahertz, and some of our mid-band spectrum, and replacing those antennas with our 600 megahertz antennas and 5G capable mid-band antennas. Radios have to be replaced as well in those cases to support 5G services. Backhaul is usually good to those sites. We've had throughout our history, we've really looked to fiber and as our primary backhaul facility. So our network was always heavily fiber based, and the vast majority of sites use fiber right now. That sometimes needs to be upgraded to support more capacity to meet the load on 5G, but that's a pretty easy thing. Once you've got fiber to the site, it's pretty easy to add capacity to those sites there.
Are there opportunities still for parties to partner with you to get additional backhaul to sites, or what sort of partnership opportunities are out there for, say, folks like INCOMPAS membership?
Right. Yeah, no, I think so. We're always looking for, and that's been one of the things that I think we've been very good at, is looking to partner with a lot of companies for things like backhaul. We don't do any ourselves. We don't do, we're not building towers ourselves, and we're not doing backhaul ourselves. So as we expand into these rural areas and increase the number of towers out there, there's always opportunity for partnerships there. And
are you most looking at fiber or microwave?
Yeah, fiber, really fiber, right? I mean, usually if we're going into a site that's a very remote site, we might have to use satellite as a temporary solution, and then potentially microwave as part of a solution. But if there's any chance of getting fiber run out to that site, we'll do that. So we would look at those primarily as very temporary solutions, particularly satellite, that wouldn't have as much capacity. But we usually move to fiber as quickly as we can, and that is where there's certainly opportunity for partnerships. And we found very successful at getting a variety of smaller providers in an area, or new providers in an area that can be creative at meeting those needs. And competitive fiber is really the solution that provides competition. And the other thing too is we're pushing out, and helping to facilitate deployment and pushing fiber into more rural areas to meet our requirements. it also provides opportunity to then expand that into areas that have never had fiber before, whether it's for schools or houses nearby. So there's a benefit to, I think, everybody that goes beyond just our network when doing something like that.
What do you look for in a vendor, and how does one vendor distinguish themselves from another in a given area? Is it mostly about being in the right place, or is it some other attributes that you're looking for?
Yeah, I think it's, and I'm not working directly with those vendors, but, I think it's going to be how, your capabilities, your ability to, work with us cooperatively. Your prices are obviously an important part of that. We do look for creative solutions, right? And as we've got this uncarrier attitude of, changing models, and we've always looked for vendors that can have a similar, similar attitude to that. So, like I said, I mean, to the extent that there may be other opportunities than just supporting our network, vendors need to look at that as they're deploying fiber. Is there a bigger opportunity that allows them to be more cost effective in our deployment because they'll have some other long-term benefit? But I think that's really it. It's the quality of the vendor. Can they deliver what we're talking about? Can they do it, quickly? Are they, a good partner to work with? Are they responsive and provide quality services and support?
That's great advice. And, we live in a really competitive wireless environment. Verizon and AT&T have deployed their own 5G networks, and, candidly, they've dismissed yours because it only delivers, say, 40 to 80 megabits per second. What do you make of their critique about performance on the network, as well as comparing your network to theirs?
Yeah.
How do you respond?
Well, people can actually find our network would be their response, right? I mean, you look at the statistics. Our 5G network is got much greater coverage than AT&T and and Verizon combined. And certainly, when you look at Verizon, who is focused primarily on a millimeter wave 5G deployment, it's incredibly spotty coverage in a small number of urban areas. So they don't really have a 5G network that's useful for consumers, and ours is. And I'd also, we deployed very quickly, and were able to, because we had, looked ahead, and our 600 as we were deploying 600 megahertz spectrum, we were deploying it with radios that could support 5G services. So we were able to turn that on very quickly and expand our coverage, at the kinds of speeds that you were talking about. But we're now going in, densifying that network and adding in the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. So you've seen some of our recent announcements, I'm sure, where we're with 2.5, we're in about 90 markets where we've deployed that. We're seeing some average speeds that are around 300 megabits per second, with speeds up to 1 gigabit per second. And we're continuing to develop that technology. We just announced, I think it was yesterday, right? The 10th, yeah. We just announced a trial that we did with Ericsson, where multi-user MIMO test, where we were able to use one 100 megahertz channel of 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, and serve 8 handsets simultaneously at about 700 megabits per second. So with beam steering, we're able to reuse that capacity and that spectrum resource multiple times within a cell sector. With what would normally be a cell sector is now just going to beams. So I think that comes out to like 2.6 gigabits per second from the base station. So So though, all of these advances are going to be out there, and we're going to have, a world-leading 5G network.
Just two quick small follow-ups. When you talk about densifying the network, are you building new sites or these small cells? Are these integrating existing sites from the combined companies, or exactly what does it mean to densify? And then for the addition of the 2.5 spectrum, is that a software type of upgrade for the existing transmitters, or is that new hardware that you're hanging on the towers?
All of the above on the densifying question. So it's, it's new towers, it's changing hardware on existing towers. It'll be small cells, but we're looking to have a big footprint and expand that coverage very, very quickly. We do have, with the Sprint merger, we made commitments about our coverage. So there are a number of stages of those commitments, but our final kind of 6-year commitment is 99% of the US population covered at 50 megabits per second or greater. And that includes 90% of the rural population at 50 megabits per second or greater. So it'll be a much more expansive network than has been out there before, and at speeds that those kinds of communities haven't seen before. And that's part of this, hurried pace of deploying all of these networks and upgrading. The 2.5 gigahertz for 5G is new hardware. We are hanging new hardware for that and new radios.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that's great. Sort of when we talk about a rapid pace, the other area where we've seen at least the commission move very, very quickly is pushing spectrum to market. We have thousands of megahertz of spectrum that has recently come onto the market. We've got auction 101, you add forward 28 gigahertz, 24 gigahertz, 37 gigahertz, 47 gigahertz. We've got 3.5s just ended. We'll talk about the specifics since we're still under the quiet period. We've got 3.7, the C-band spectrum coming up, and a newly announced 3.45 gigahertz band auction. We all know that spectrum is the fuel for wireless broadband, but is the well kind of running dry here? Where else do we go from here in terms of getting more spectrum resources, or are you going to be digesting what's here for quite some time? How does this work?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I mean, I spent a lot of my time trying to figure out where we're going to get additional spectrum from, and it takes many years, a lot of times, to bring that to fruition. And we've now have this kind of tsunami of spectrum that's come down the pipeline kind of all at once. And kudos to Chairman Bai for making that happen. It's been an incredible amount that's come down. And we do have, like you said, I mean, there are a couple of auctions coming up. We've got the C-band 3.7 gigahertz auction coming up. 2.5 gigahertz white space auction will come after that. Chairman announced first half of 2021 for that auction, which is a great opportunity to put a lot of spectrum that's been kind of on the sidelines for a while to use. And then following that will be 3.4 gigahertz spectrum, 3450 to 3500, that DoD has announced that they can make available. After that, I think that they're looking at extending further down into that 3.3 gigahertz band, kind of 3.1 to 3.4 gigahertz, and looking at sharing opportunities there. And there's a kind of a handful of other bands that are around that are probably being looked at, but those are really the big chunks. I think it's if we can get all of that out in a very usable way, then that is a pretty good pipeline of spectrum. And it's interesting too, because competition has changed over the years, where now it used to be a very limited number of bands that all the carriers used and we were all in. And what we're seeing now are some different strategies and carriers kind of gravitating to one band or one portion of a band, or or different portions of bands. I said like Verizon, where they've concentrated their 5G rollout in millimeter wave, right? And that was their strategy. We've had a more inclusive, where we include all of the bands. AT&T is a little bit more in between on that, but we also are seeing, like with massive amounts of unlicensed spectrum that have been freed up, there's new ways for those carriers to compete, or for carriers like the cable companies to compete, right? Comcast, Charter are using unlicensed as their first kind of primary way to compete there, and they've got infrastructure that can support that with a dense fiber network and a lot of endpoints. So that whole, and CBRS, right? And CBRS is not included, as even though it's being used for mobile broadband, it's not included in the screen. But that's another area where it's spectrum that's out there that's being used to compete. So we've gotten a much bigger pool. Competition around it is changing as as not only carriers but others begin to compete in this space, and we begin to compete with with others. I mentioned the cable companies. Part of what we're doing, and part of the one of the benefits that we got out of the Sprint merger and all that, the capacity in that 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, is that we are going to be entering competition for fixed broadband services. So fixed services to the home, which we've never been able to compete in before, and we've got some trials in now. But now we'll be going head to head with cable companies in an area where we've never competed before, and with new resources that will allow us to do that very effectively.
Yeah, and as I recall from the merger, you have certain coverage metrics for offering that broadband to the home service as a result of your merger.
Yes, yeah.
In the millions of customers, so really
yes.
a force to be reckoned with in the near future.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and that'll depend on area by area on just how much the network can support in in an individual area, about how many customers will be able to make an offer or to support within there. But that gets better and better as we get more spectrum and can deploy more spectrum. The number of customers that we'd be able to provide that to increases.
Absolutely. Well, changing gears a little bit, although still on the topic of geographic reach of the service, another related issue is broadband mapping and trying to figure out where broadband services are. It's bedeviled the commission for many years because, especially with wireless networks, it can change by time of day as a result of network configurations or traffic patterns, and it really can vary, and it's been a challenge for the commission and many others to try to identify where broadband coverage does and does not exist on the wireless side. It's even challenging to some degree on the wireline side. Congress has moved forward to try to help out with a broadband mapping piece of legislation, but it's unfunded. Do you think there's some opportunities here? I know you've got an engineering role, but you also have one foot in the political world. Do you think we have any opportunity to see that fully funded? And if we don't, is there a way the commission could advance the ball and give us greater visibility into where broadband is and isn't?
Yeah. Well, I think that there would be funding opportunities. I mean, and it's everybody wants accurate information and accurate maps, and that's bipartisan. So if there's something that they can agree on, it should be how to make that information available. Certainly the FCC, for their part, they adopted rules recently that will require us to, and rules that go well beyond what the congressional mandate was for them to do, right? They're requiring us to submit multiple maps. I think we're going to end up submitting 9 different maps. 3G, 4G, 5G services at different rates, different conditions, and and mobile coverage maps. So the challenge is really going to be how that information is presented to consumers. consumers, I don't, if they just want to get service, right? They want to make sure they can do, either make a phone call or run apps and get, good quality services. So trying to sort through those different maps is, is going to be, I think, the biggest challenge, and how to present that in a way that's not totally confusing to consumers. The other thing is going to be, and then the other part of it will be the challenge process that they're adopting. Is going to be, it's going to be an interesting exercise too, because given the difficulty we've had before on challenging some of the maps, or like around Mobility Fund 2, even the FCC did a staff report, but the FCC staff didn't follow their own measurement parameters. So, we responded to that report, pointing out all of the fundamental flaws that they had and how they took their measurements. And they haven't responded, but I think it's going to get more and more confusing and more difficult to make sure that everybody is measuring the same thing when you're doing those kinds of challenges. But I think we all have the same objective of, accurate information that consumers can use.
Either as a consumer, individual, or as a company, do you have a preferred way of presenting that multi-layered, complex portrait of what coverage or broadband connectivity looks like?
I don't know that we have a good way to do that yet. I mean, I think it's just got to be clear on what what technology is being used, the need to have devices that support that technology when you're doing measurements, right? Somebody that's trying to look at a 5G network that's got a 4G phone but isn't really sure the difference. They're not going to get a 5G result with that phone. And even as we add all of these different bands, it gets more and more complicated. I did a cross-country trip with my wife to visit our daughter, who's in college out in Santa Fe, and she's got a phone that doesn't have our 600 megahertz spectrum. And
oh wow,
she would be frustrated because she wouldn't have service, and I would have it, with a phone that has our 600 megahertz band. So even though she had 700 megahertz, she didn't have 600, and there's a big difference there. So just making sure that people understand some of those differences and limitations. And, unfortunately, it changes quickly as some of these new bands that we talked about are, come on the market, become available, and are deployed. But we do try and, on our website, we do have and are always improving the mapping that we provide to consumers, so that they can get more and more information and really zero in on their area, and look at the kind of signal strength, what types of services they should expect, the reliability of the service in that area. So we're always trying to improve the information that we make directly available to customers.
And what about broadband funding, particularly the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund? Chairman Pai has announced his intent to push forward with the $16 billion phase one program of distributing support without complete visibility into the broadband environment in terms of a comprehensive set of maps. Does T-Mobile have a position on that issue, whether to proceed forward with or without maps? Because this first phase is intended to focus on completely unserved areas.
Yeah. Well, and we've said you really need maps, right? You really need to look at what what consumers have available. And I think the commission would like to move quickly to, and frankly, the commissions and their proposal was tried to do a forward look at what we would be building, but that's a very difficult thing to do, to predict that. I do think that there are ways for them to do it if they really just focused on the most rural areas where it's clear that there is, little opportunity for anybody to deploy networks, right? I mean, whether it's in, national parks or places where there really are no people, but that, people may end up going. Those are the most difficult places to fund. And they've looked at a weighting factor and are evaluating a weighting factor to try and push those dollars to those most rural areas. And that's something that I think if they get that right, that'll be an important part of making sure that, as we and others expand our service into more rural areas without funding, that their funding will go into areas that are the least likely for us to be able to, the least likely that we would cover without additional funding.
Right. On the subject of funding, and I know we're running short of time here, is there a different way of subsidizing broadband? Because there are going to be areas that are just uneconomic to serve. The population density is not there, or the site is so costly to connect with fiber or microwave for the backhaul. It will have high expenses and low profitability or low revenues. What's the right way to fund that type of low density, high cost environment? And is it a universal service vehicle? Is it something else? And do you have any sense of how much it might be to connect the tens of millions of Americans who are continuing not to receive broadband service?
Well, so I'm not sure if I don't know that
It's a tough question.
On the amount or exactly the best funding source. I do think some of the proposals out there and to provide that funding and weight it so that it's into the most rural areas makes a lot of sense. We do have a commitment to build out coverage that will cover 90% of the rural pops at 50 megabits per second. So that's strong coverage, and that's at 50 megabits per second. So you can imagine that it'll be extended out beyond that to some extent at lower speeds. So there's going to be the footprint over the U.S. is going to be very solid from
T-Mobile's network.
Right, exactly right, and and hopefully that drives additional competition in the areas and additional deployments. I don't know that I've got a good solution on a better way to fund those really high cost areas. But and we still do run into challenges though on siting in national parks and government lands. So some of what they can do is just make sure that those areas with those siting challenges are made more and more accessible. And some of the siting challenges still are challenges, right? I mean, there's still zoning challenges and do make coverage difficult.
Yeah, I think wireless infrastructure siting is going to continue to be an issue because everything is local at that point, and it has to do with whether you're a national forest, national park, particular zoning concerns. So we probably won't come to a resolution of that one either today. But Steve, I want to thank you for your time. This has been great and very informative, and I think you've got a lot of work to do, but a lot to be proud of in terms of T-Mobile's rapid deployment of 5G. So thanks for joining us today.
Great, thanks. Yeah, we're just beginning, so it only gets better. So, thanks, for having me.